Hey everyone, welcome to this deep dive all about the latest in U.S.-Russia relations. We've got some really interesting stuff to unpack for you guys. The big news is that for the first time in 3 years, high-level officials from both the U.S. and Russia actually sat down together for talks.
Yeah, and these talks just wrapped up in Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia.
It wasn't just like a quick handshake and a photo op either.
No.
No, these were serious discussions.
Yeah?
With some real heavy hitters involved.
Like who?
We're talking top diplomats, advisors, folks like Lavrov from the Russian side.
Right.
And even U.S. Secretary of State Rubio was there leading the American delegation.
So this was a big deal.
Huge, and to really set the stage, Presidents Putin and Trump even had a phone call before the talks even started.
Oh, wow. Okay, so they kind of like set the tone a little bit.
Exactly, laying the groundwork for some, potentially productive diplomacy.
So let's dive into some of the specifics then. What actually came out of these talks?
Well, one of the first things that really stood out was this agreement to bring staffing levels back up at their embassies.
Oh, interesting. So in Moscow and Washington.
Yeah, exactly. It's a step towards, getting things back to normal.
Back to normal.
At least in terms of diplomatic relations.
Right.
It's a way of reopening those lines of communication that have been pretty much frozen for years.
So almost like a symbolic gesture to show that?
Yeah, I think there's definitely some symbolism there, but it's also practical too.
Okay.
You need people on the ground to talk to each other, to build relationships, to sort things out.
Makes sense. And it wasn't just about embassy staff either, right?
No, they also agreed to set up this whole system for tackling all these little things that have been causing friction in the relationship.
What kinds of things?
Well, they're calling them irritants, but basically it's stuff like visa issues, property disputes, frozen bank transfers.
Ah, so like bureaucratic headaches.
Exactly, little things that on their own might not seem like a big deal.
Right.
But they can really build up and create this negative atmosphere.
Yeah, death by 1,000 paper cuts.
Exactly. And the interesting thing is they're not just trying to come up with like one-off solutions for each issue.
Oh, so a more systematic approach.
Right. They want to create a framework to smooth things out moving forward.
Interesting. Okay, now let's get to what everyone's really talking about, the proposed peace plan for Ukraine.
Yeah, this is the big one. This is where things could really get interesting.
So break it down for us.
Okay, so the proposal has 3 main steps.
3 steps, all right.
First, a ceasefire to stop the fighting.
Okay.
Second, elections in Ukraine.
Okay.
And then finally, a binding agreement to settle the conflict once and for all.
It sounds almost too good to be true. I mean, can they actually pull this off?
Well, it's definitely ambitious. There are a lot of moving parts, a lot of people who need to be on board.
Right.
But both sides have agreed to appoint these high-level teams to hash out the details.
Okay, so we don't know who those negotiators will be yet.
Not yet. Putin's actually waiting to see who the U.S. picks for their team before he makes his decision.
Oh, so it's like a chess match.
Yeah, there's a lot of strategic maneuvering going on behind the scenes, for sure.
Fascinating. So where do sanctions fit into all of this? Will they be lifted if this peace plan actually works?
Well, Secretary Rubio was pretty clear as that point.
What did he say?
He said sanctions relief is possible, but only if a peace deal is reached.
So it's a big if.
Right, and even then, it's not just up to the U.S.
Oh, right. Other countries have imposed sanctions too.
Exactly. The European Union in particular has a whole set of sanctions, so any relief would require a coordinated effort.
So there's a lot riding on this peace plan.
Absolutely. It's not just about Ukraine. It has implications for the whole global landscape.
Okay, so we've got diplomacy, we've got a potential path to peace, but what about the economic side of things?
Well, beyond the politics, there's a huge economic angle to all of this.
Right.
Russians actually put forward a bunch of proposals for joint projects with the U.S.,
Oh, really? Like what?
particularly in the Arctic.
The Arctic. Now, why the Arctic?
Well, think about it. The Arctic is believed to hold these vast, untapped reserves of oil and natural gas.
Oh, okay, so as climate change melts the ice.
Exactly. Access to those resources is becoming more and more feasible.
So are we talking about like a new energy frontier?
Potentially, both the U.S. and Russia see the economic potential there.
So joint exploration, joint production, maybe even building pipelines and infrastructure.
It's all on the table, but of course, there are also environmental concerns to consider.
Right. I mean, the Arctic is an incredibly fragile ecosystem.
Exactly. So any development there would need to be done very carefully with a focus on sustainability.
So a lot of potential, but also a lot of responsibility.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've got diplomatic progress, a potential peace plan for Ukraine, and the possibility of some really lucrative economic partnerships, especially in the Arctic. It's a lot to process.
It really is, and it'll be fascinating to see how things play out in the coming months and years.
Definitely. All right, well, we'll have to leave it there for now, but we'll be back soon to dive deeper into some of these issues and explore what they mean for the future of U.S.-Russia relations.
It's really amazing to think about how these talks could affect the whole world.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. and Russia, they're major players on the global stage, right?
Exactly. So if they can actually start working together, it could have huge implications for everything from global security to trade to even the fight against climate change.
Okay, so let's break that down a little bit, starting with global security,
All right. Well, if they can actually manage to bring peace to Ukraine,
right?
that could be a model for resolving other conflicts peacefully, too.
So it sets a precedent.
Exactly. Like, hey, if the US and Russia can work things out, maybe others can too.
And on the economic side,
Well, a thaw in relations could mean a lot more trade and investment between the two countries.
I mean, Russia has tons of natural resources, right?
Exactly. And a highly educated workforce.
And then you've got the U.S., which is a leader in technology and innovation.
Right? So there's a lot of potential for these two economies to really complement each other.
So maybe we'll start to see more joint ventures, technology transfers access to new markets.
Possibly. But it's not just about the US and Russia either.
Right, there's so many other countries that are kind of tied to one side or the other.
Exactly. So this shift in dynamics could really shake things up for them.
So some countries might feel vulnerable if they think the U.S. is backing away.
Yeah, especially in Eastern Europe.
But on the other hand,
Some countries that have been trying to stay neutral might see this as a chance to step in,
to kind of play a bigger role.
right? Maybe as mediators between the US and Russia.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential for peace, the economic opportunities. But let's go back to those specific economic proposals that Russia made, especially the ones about the Arctic.
Right. Remember we were talking about all that oil and natural gas up there?
Yeah, as the ice melts.
It's becoming more and more accessible, and both the US and Russia see the dollar signs.
So they could potentially work together on everything from exploration and production.
To building pipelines and infrastructure.
But what about the environmental risks?
Well, that's a huge concern, obviously.
Right, the Arctic is such a delicate ecosystem
Exactly. So any development up there would have to be done extremely carefully.
with a lot of international cooperation
Definitely, the US and Russia would have to work together with other Arctic nations.
to make sure things are done sustainably.
Right, because the stakes are incredibly high.
So even if they could figure out all the practical stuff, there's still the issue of trust.
Yeah, after all these years of animosity and broken promises.
Can they really build a relationship based on mutual respect?
Some people say no, the mistrust runs too deep.
But others are more optimistic.
They see these talks as a genuine effort to break free from that cycle of hostility.
So it really comes down to whether both sides are willing to compromise,
And to see cooperation as a win-win.
not just a zero-sum game.
Exactly. And ultimately, it's the leaders who will decide which path to take.
Putin and Trump.
Their decisions will shape the future of this relationship.
So we've got diplomacy, peace, talks, economic opportunities. But there's still a lot of uncertainty.
Definitely. It's a complex picture with a lot of moving parts.
But that's what makes it so fascinating.
Exactly. These talks have opened up a whole new world of possibilities.
And it's anyone's guess where things will go from here.
Well, let's explore some of those possibilities. What are the different scenarios that could play out?
Right. What could the next chapter look like? All right. So we've talked about the talks, the potential for peace, and even some economic opportunities. But the big question is, what happens next? What's the future of U.S.-Russia relations?
Well, it's tough to say for sure. Predicting the future of this relationship is never easy. There are so many factors at play, but we can at least explore some possible scenarios, some paths this whole thing might take.
Okay, so what are we looking at? What kind of future could we be heading towards?
Well, let's start with the most optimistic scenario, what I'd call the thaw.
The thaw. Okay, I like it.
In this scenario, the momentum from these recent talks just keeps building. Both sides follow through on what they've agreed to, and we see some real concrete progress on things like the conflict in Ukraine and, just getting diplomatic relations back on track.
So we're talking sanctions getting lifted, trade and investment picking up, maybe even some big joint projects like in energy or space exploration.
Exactly. But it's not just about the concrete actions. It's about a change in mindset, too.
Okay, so what do you mean?
Both sides would have to move away from this idea that it's a zero-sum game, that one side can only win if the other side loses.
Right.
They'd have to start seeing cooperation as something that benefits both of them, even if it means making some compromises along the way.
That sounds pretty ideal, but let's be real here. What if things don't go so smoothly? What's the opposite of the thaw?
Well, on the other end of the spectrum, you've got what I call the deep freeze.
Ooh, that sounds ominous.
Yeah, in this scenario, the initial optimism just fades away, the talks break down, and we basically go right back to where we started: mistrust, hostility, the whole 9 yards.
So the conflict in Ukraine keeps dragging on, sanctions stay in place, and the relationship just keeps getting worse.
Exactly. Think Cold War rhetoric, military buildups, a real risk of confrontation, even if it's accidental.
That's a pretty scary thought. What could push us in that direction towards the deep freeze?
Well, a lot of things. Unfortunately, domestic politics could make it tough for leaders to compromise. They might be afraid of looking weak.
Right.
And then there's always the risk of some unexpected event on the global stage, something that just throws everything off balance.
Or maybe both sides just fail to deliver on their promises.
Exactly. Words are one thing, but actions speak louder.
So we've got the thaw and the deep freeze, but is there something in between, like a middle ground?
Yeah, there's a scenario I call muddle through.
Muddle through. Okay, so what does that look like?
Basically, it's a mixed bag. Some progress here, some setbacks there. You might see some limited cooperation on certain issues.
Like what kind of issue?
Things like arms control, maybe counterterrorism. But the overall relationship stays pretty competitive. Still a lot of rivalry.
So sanctions might be partially eased, there might be a lot of trade deals here and there, but tensions remain high over things like Ukraine and NATO.
Exactly. It's not a breakthrough, but it's not a total collapse either.
So just kind of keeping things steady as they go.
Pretty much a kind of pragmatic coexistence where both sides try to manage the relationship without expecting too much.
Out of those three scenarios, which one do you think is the most likely?
Honestly, given all the history, all the mistrust, I'd have to say muddle through seems the most probable. We'll likely see some cooperation, some competition. It's going to be messy. But that's kind of how this relationship has always been.
Okay, so what does all of this mean for the average person? What should we be paying attention to?
I think the main takeaway is that U.S.-Russia relations are going to stay important no matter what happens. It's a relationship that affects everyone. So stay informed, keep up with the news, try to understand all the different sides of the story.
Great advice. And that's exactly what we try to do here on Deep Dive.
Exactly. We break things down. We look at all the angles so you can make sense of the world.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have for today. But thanks for joining us on this deep dive into U.S.-Russia relations. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Absolutely. And who knows what the future holds, but we'll be here to break it all down for you when it happens.
That's right. So subscribe to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear, new episodes every day.